Good morning, Bardstown and Nelson County, and welcome to another edition of Bradford and Brooks. Jim Brooks and Margie Bradford with you this morning. Good morning, Margie.
Morning, Jim.
Well, we had storms, I guess the remnants of Hurricane Beryl, I guess came through the area last night, but thankfully I don't think we saw...
Thankfully it was a small remnant.
well, in parts of the state they got some heavy weather, but fortunately we did not. So I'm appreciative of that. The only thing only damage in my house was an empty garbage can that got blown over. So I'll take that happily.
That's a pretty common victim at your house, I think.
Well, yeah, it's always windy at my house. All right. Margie, today we're very blessed to have a wonderful studio guest with us this morning to talk of all things bourbon here in Nelson County and Bardstown. Imagine that. Bourbon discussed in Bardstown. It's everywhere. It's everywhere.
Without it being drunk.
Well, that's what we left out today's show.
That's right. We
should have
no active participation in the subject.
We should have some shots lined up here in the studio. Yeah. It would make for some... Now, my father used to call his favorite Heaven Hill proof, he called it conversation water.
Conversation water.
Boy, the conversation did flow after a few shots.
There we go.
Anyway, Dixie Hibbs is...
It also makes people think they're funnier than they are.
Well, that's true. That's true. And some of us don't even need bourbon
to do that.
For that. So
that's right.
Myself included. All right, our guest today is Dixie Hibbs.
Good morning.
Local historian, and as Margie's fond to say, Bardstown Google.
Yeah, that's right.
That's right. Bardstown's Google.
Well, it works pretty well. As long as I can keep my memory. I'm having some problems with it. You got to get ragged around the edges there. I told someone, if you're not 100 years old, I won't remember your name, that way. But, no, and I appreciate the subject. We, when I'm on once a month, we talk a lot about what's happened in the 20th century. And so there were a lot of references to the ups and downs of bourbon during that 100 years. And if you give me a little minute, as a historian, I have to start from the beginning.
Sure.
Kentucky. Western Virginia is what we were when we started, but the reason we make bourbon in Kentucky was because the Pennsylvania distillers came down, the Virginia people came, they knew how to make whiskey, they usually used rye, but in Kentucky corn grew so well, so quickly, and there was a way to transport their product to market. The rivers in Kentucky were used as roads. Now, if you think about the other states around us, a lot of them are flatter, not as much elevation changing and all. But they tell me we have 33 rivers in Kentucky. I've never been able to name them all, but I could come up with about 16. But even 16 different rivers, they're flowing into each other, provided great a highway to go to the big rivers and down the river to Memphis, Vicksburg, New Orleans, and on a ship around to the East Coast. Now, you have to use your imagination at the time. Today, when you look at those big warehouses and the big distilleries and all the product going in and out every day, the trucks moving, you have no idea how long it took to make the whiskey of the early 1800s. They made barrels of it, and that's what they put the product in. We still do that. They put it in barrels because that's what they put everything in. Now, I do like to straighten out the myth about Mr. Elijah Craig's barn burning and the barrels. That's how the charring came about. Charred barrels were very common back in the early 1800s because they put everything in barrels. They put salted pork, they put kraut, they put pickles, all types of things. Apples, apples in a barrel after a while kind of get soft and smushy. Well,
and ferment.
And ferment, yeah. Now that's brandy, what they're working on there. But what they would do, they would dump the contents out, and then they would fill it up with straw and set it afire. And the straw burning would kill the bacteria, some of the extra slivers of wood and stuff that might still be in there, and again, reuse the barrel. And they didn't have to burn it to pieces to do that. They just had to pretty much clean the inside of it. Now, the whiskey that was put in burned barrels tasted different than the whiskey put in new barrels, and that was really the difference. The ones in New Orleans, the people said, yeah, the guy who brought this down, we really like it. Tell him to bring some more. And that's kind of what was going on. So after the success of the first aged whiskey in burned barrels, everybody did it. Now, aged whiskey is a misnomer for them. They would make it in the spring, put it in a barrel, sit it around till February, put it on a flatboat, start down the river. 3 months later, they might get to New Orleans. So it's a whole year old when they sold it. So that whiskey then and the whiskey now were nothing alike, thank goodness. But they were selling everything they could send to New Orleans and on. But talking about bourbon in the late 1800s, I'm going to skip on after the Civil War. I always give credit to the Civil War of increasing our customer base. We were occupied by the Union soldiers, and I say we, Nelson County, from the September of 1861 till September of 1865. Now you realize the surrender of Lee was in April. What are we doing still having Union soldiers here? Well, they stayed and they stayed and they stayed, and finally in September 65 they left. The good thing that happened to us, as all those Union soldiers passed through Bardstown and the training camps, they developed a taste for whiskey, bourbon whiskey. So when they went back home to Minnesota, Michigan, Illinois, Indiana, Missouri, and all, they wanted bourbon whiskey. So being occupied did have a side benefit, so to speak. After the Civil War, the railroads were here. The one in New Haven actually came in 1856 from Lebanon Junction, which is why Lebanon Junction has its name. It went from the L&N line going to Nashville, took off from Lebanon Junction over to Lebanon, and eventually down into Tennessee. So during the Civil War, there was a lot of Union occupancy of Lebanon. Along that road, after the Civil War, would build up about 10 new distilleries. Some of them had been smaller versions off the track, so to speak, away from it, but they would move it over to the railroad because that's your shipping. They didn't have to put it in a wagon, take it somewhere, they loaded it on the railroad. This went on fine. We had 27 different distilleries in this area, 2 in LaRue County, 3 in Bullitt County, and 22 in Nelson County.
Wow.
Now today, the distilleries we have in Nelson County make more whiskey in one day than all of those made in probably 5 years. Their production was limited in the size of their stills. It was also limited in the product. They always had local corn. They didn't have to go very far for corn. Rye, they raised that also. They had a good spring of water, and they had expertise of the people that had been making whiskey in their families for 3 and 4 and 5 generations. The Samuels family, the Beam family, the Dant family, the Boone family, various ones that still are making whiskey. The 1896 is where I have a lot of information about that, so I talk a lot about it. They had, at this point, were bottling whiskey. 1879 is when the first bottling came about. Now, not every distillery had a bottling line, but the distilleries would make the whiskey. Sometimes they would ship it to another site and it would be bottled, labeled and bottled, and then it was sent to a distributor, mostly in Louisville. Now, when the distributors got really greedy, they started watering down the barrels. So this is what came along, what they call bottled in bond.
Right.
Well, bottled in bond doesn't sound very sexy, but it is an affirmation that the U.S. government is guaranteeing that what you are getting in this barrel or in this bottle is 100 proof whiskey. And they, because it's been inspected and signed off on by the government. Even the warehouses that along these old distilleries, they have them. They have the bonded warehouses and they have the others. And most of them were wooden, but some of them were brick. In New Hope, Mr. Miles had brick warehouses. They kept warmer in the winter, maybe, or cold, I don't know, but they certainly were big, substantial things. And I wonder how many people used those bricks to build something again after they were torn down, but they closed around 1900. Something else I'm going to mention, when we talk about 27 distilleries, by 1920, when Prohibition came along, there were only 12 operating distilleries in Nelson County. Now, what happened to the others? First of all, there are big distilleries. Over in Athertonville, Mr. Atherton had 2 big distilleries. One was Windsor and the other was Athertonville. And he was very educated, a very good businessman, and there were other large distilleries all over Kentucky. And they determined to eliminate those small distilleries that were their competition. And as many industries do, they eliminate them by buying them up and closing them. Between 96 and 20, at least 10 of the local distilleries were done that way. And they weren't huge distilleries, but they had a good reputation. They had a good market. They kept it fairly small. You know, we talk about Maker's Mark in the beginning, how it was limited in how many bottles and all they made. Well, they became very desirable to get one. When you knew you didn't have many or didn't have the chance to buy many, you started looking really quick, and when you bought one, you bought two so that you'd have it. Well, that was happening too. A lot of the early labels are names of the people. The people who actually were the distillers. You had Jim Beam, of course, but he didn't have Jim Beam in his in the 1890s. He and his father had a distillery out close to Nazareth, and their main label was Old Tub. And Old Tub had a representation of a barrel-like tub, a barrel that somebody was stirring the mash in. And they used that in the 1800s, and they used it again in the early 1930s when they first started over in Bullitt County. I don't know when they quit using it, but they really should have.
Old Tub.
Old Tub, yeah.
I remember that brand back when I was a teenager.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it was a budget brand.
Yes.
And it had the picture of a tub on it.
It had a tub with the stirring, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to mention a little bit about Prohibition. I said 12 operating distilleries. The first Prohibition was when the First World War started. The government said, we need the corn. We need it for our war effort. So they stopped everybody from making and selling it. Well, they had about 18 months between the war end and 1920, and that opened it up, and they tried to sell everything they could because all the distilleries here still had whiskey in them. When you put whiskey in a distillery, it's to age it, and anywhere from 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 years. Very little of the whiskey early on was 10 years old, as I mentioned. But even today, a bourbon whiskey has to be aged a very minimum of 2 years. But I would never drink 2-year-old whiskey. You might as well get rubbing alcohol. But anyway, I would. Well, it's not very good. Let's just put it that way. But the longer you age it in that barrel, the more you get softened up, take the edge off of it, and you get the color, because all whiskeys go in those barrels clear.
Yeah.
If somebody really wanted to steal it, they could steal it right there, fill up the barrel with water, and nobody'd know until they went to bottle it. Now, I'm going to tell you, that's what happened during Prohibition, though. People would steal whiskey, siphon it out of the barrels in the warehouses, put it in things like milk, not jars, what am I talking about? Cans, thank you. The milk can, I remember, silver with the top on them, and things like that, and fill up the barrels with water. That happened out at T.W. Samuels. Then there was a newspaper article, headline saying, "Whiskey Bobbery, Bobbery," and I thought, that's a terrible mistake. How did they let that get out? Well, it meant the Bobbery was like a misstep. That the robbery, the people had gone in, and because these barrels were close to the door, they went and drained the barrels close to the door, took off with them, and the life was on them because they were draining colored water that had been sitting in that barrel for a couple of years. It was the weakest whiskey they'd ever had, you know. But again, during Prohibition, we had a lot of comings and goings. Most of the thefts that happened came from out of county, out of state. Now, our moonshiners usually were local. They did make moonshine and they did sell it. And there were different penalties for it and all. But they kind of felt like, I used to say that the January 1920, that changing of the Constitution actually made criminals out of half of the people in Nelson County. And that's really a bad number because it really didn't. The opportunity to be criminals there. Right. But a lot of them had already been working in the distilleries. Farmers didn't have any place to sell their corn. Truck drivers were out of work. Barrel makers were out of work. I mean, it was the Depression, 10 years before the Depression came along. But we survived it, and after the Depression, not all the distilleries reopened. McKenna had never quite closed over in Fairfield. We had 2 new distilleries to open here, which would be Willett's on Loretta Road and Heaven Hill. Heaven Hill's owners, the Shapiros, had never had anything to do with whiskey making. They knew how to run a business, and they knew how to make money running a business, but they had never been involved in whiskey making, where the Willett's, Mr. Willett, had made whiskey for Beam at Clear Spring, and I'm using a lot of names you may not remember, but these distilleries all had names that changed over the years. And it's not that the distillery moved or that even the ownership moved. the change of names sometimes went about when someone else wanted them to make whiskey under their label, and they would rent it under the name of like Clear Spring or TNC or whatever initials, whatever that. And that has been going on since we began making whiskey, particularly after Civil War. The distillers would contract to make whiskey for someone, store it, and then bottle it, and they would pay them for it. Today, that is what Bardstown Bourbon has been doing. And everybody thought that was so odd that you did this. Well, it's worked really well for Bardstown Bourbon. A lot of people want to have their own label. I say people, groups of people. I know there's a lot of veterans that like to get together and do that. There's families that have maybe a mash bill or a recipe their family used to use when they were in the distilling business. And so they take it out to Bardstown Bourbon, contract with them to make it. At one point, I talked to Steve Nally, who is the distiller out there, one of the distillers, and he said they had 49 mash bills. That would be like having 49 recipes for biscuits, you know. But
how you wonder how they keep that separated?
Oh, I about have to. I mean, it's all on the ingredients, how long they're cooked, how long they're fermented, but the ingredients make the difference there. And
no, but I meant how they physically keep it.
No, you put them in a warehouse and have everything.
Got a label on them.
Yeah, they have the labels on the barrels are noted. It would be like anybody's inventory. How do you keep these baseball caps from these baseball caps? Well, they're in a box, they're in a barrel, and they've got a record of them, and they're paying tax on them the whole time they're in the barrel, except the person, the group that they've made them for. In other words, they've contracted with somebody.
Right.
So they're paying the tax on it. They're paying the storage on it. So you keep up with that because that's your income.
Right. You know, Dixie, I want to ask you something. Cartoons would show, like people drinking out of a jug rather than a bottle. You were saying when they went in. Was that jug thing simply what the moonshiners would use, or was that
No, the jugs were used early on. It's pottery. It's made out of clay, and it's fired and all. And like I mentioned about the early barrels weren't even 52-gallon. They were smaller. And they did not even have metal rings on them. They had hickory rings. And they would take hickory is very strong wood, and they would soak it, and they would put it around the staves of the barrel, and they made a little hook, like a half of an arrowhead that hooked into half of an arrowhead. And once that dried, it kept it together, and they'd use that barrel till it literally fell apart. But there again, the same way with buckets. Your jugs, though, held. You couldn't really. Buckets and barrels did leak. You had to be careful about those, but they had things they fixed them with. Jugs were used from early on, just like making pottery, plates and cups and things for liquid. And they were handy to put a stopper in, or even the jug has a little ring there. You put your finger through or your thumb, it puts it up on your shoulder, and you can drink out of it. They didn't have the only straws they had were from reeds in the creek. You could do that. Now they use those sometimes to siphon from the barrels in the warehouses. Talking about the bottles, though, we had glass bottles before 1879. But what caused this was again, bottle and bond, because in order to control what was being put in those barrels and put out for use, for sale, they could control it in the distillery by bottling it up, and the U.S. stamp on it proved it was what was said on the outside. Okay. In Louisville, Brown Foreman were the first ones to bottle. And it was quite a thing, and it was never this all this machinery that pushes it down the line and slaps the label on. All this was hand done. This was hand filled, pass it on, put it in the cardboard box and all that, or wooden box. All of that was handwork, so to speak. As I mentioned, some of these here in Nelson County did not bottle at the distillery, but some of them did. I have pictures of bottling rooms, and most of the time, women worked in the bottling rooms. They had putting labels on particularly because they took more care about making sure they were level or straight, making sure the stamps were on them and things like that. So that was one of the jobs that women were sought after for. The men had to lift a lot, heavy and stuff, and of course they worked in the hot
Warehouse.
a distillery where they were fermenting and cooking. You cook it first. You put your grains together and cook it. Then you cool that down. And you have to cool it down below 72 degrees because you're going to add yeast to it. The yeast is what causes the fermentation and creates the alcohol. And every distillery had a different yeast. Now, that sounds strange because how many different yeasts can you have? Most of them, if they found one that worked with their product, they kept it, and they kept regrowing it, so to speak.
They called it the mother or something like that.
I'm not sure about that one, but I understand what you're talking about. It's like when you're trying to do some kind of a thing in a jar in your kitchen, yeah. Sourdough bread or something, yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Starter.
Same, they start that. In fact, after Heaven Hill's fire, the first time I saw Craig Beam, who is Parker's son, I said, "Did you get the yeast jug?" He said, "Yes." And I said, "That's the first question I had. Question, do you get burned or anything? Did you get the yeast jug?" Because it was kept in a refrigerator close to where the mash was going to be cooked and all, and where the fermentation was going to take place. And that distillery burned, but that's the first thing he went and got before he left the distillery. They said Jim Beam kept his mash in his refrigerator all through the Prohibition. I think it had to regrow several times, but anyway, it's not golden, but it seems to be golden to the distillers and all. I want to mention the distillers are here. Someone asked me why we call ourselves the bourbon capital. Well, we've always had distilleries here. I say always. I can go back to 1795 and tell you we had distilleries here. They were small, and I like to say that Nelson County in Bardstown is known for its hospitality. And have you ever gone any place in Bardstown into somebody's house and they haven't offered you a drink of tea or a drink of coffee or a Coke or something?
Right.
We're offering you a drink.
Yeah.
Well, we offered those drinks to those Union soldiers, and they liked them so well that later on they kept buying them. Our hospitality has been very successful, and it still is. Even if you don't offer the whiskey drink, you offer them a smile or directions. Or I had to turn somebody around; they were going in the wrong way the other day, and I did it nicely and said, "I'm sure you don't want to go down this street. Why don't you go over here and here and here?" You know, kind of deal. But I don't. Whiskey did not make Bardstown. It did not. Our hospitality is what made Bardstown. The bourbon whiskey is a result of the expertise of the people who came here, the water, the weather, and again, the expertise of the people. And this was such a easy place to have it. We had lots of springs. We had lots of limestone springs, which is very clean. You don't have sulfur water in it. And then again, like I mentioned, the roads. Kentucky bourbon used to be called Western whiskey because this was before the Louisiana Purchase. We were the west part of the United States, yeah. Today, the bourbon capital of the world, we have, I think, 9 distilleries, and that's something I can't keep up. They pop up so much. But I want to name some of them and tell you where they came from, so to speak. I wasn't sure I liked the idea of the bourbon capital of the world, but it's better than being the cornbread capital of the world or something. I don't know. Willett Distillery was the one I mentioned that was built after Prohibition, but the family Willets had been making whiskey here for many years. Mm-hmm. Now, Four Roses does not have a distillery here, but they have a bottling house out on Cox's Creek, which is on the 245 road. Mm-hmm. So we claim that one too. Luxrow is the newest one. No, not the newest. It's the it was 10 years ago, 12 years. It was one of the newer ones. And it was the first one built after 1936. First distillery built in North after 1936. The Preservation Distillery went out on the New Haven Road, bought Hillbilly Heaven, and turned those barns into their craft distillery. Now, the difference in craft distillery and the larger ones was the amount of whiskey that you make. And today in Kentucky, there's over 75 different distilleries. Less than 40 are large ones. The others are craft distilleries. Mm-hmm. You have to have all the licensing. You have to have all of the details as a bigger distillery, but you can operate on a smaller scale, and you can have probably more control over changing your formula and things like that, because it's not a hobby. Please don't let me, I'm not insulting anybody saying it's a hobby. It's very expensive. But there again, you get the opportunity to try to make something all your own with your own recipe. I bet we need a commercial.
It's about that time.
All right.
All right. You're listening to Bradford and Brooks and our very special guest,
You want some water?
Dixie Hibbs,
I'll-
talking about bourbon today, of all things, here in Bardstown, the bourbon capital of the world. We'll be back with more with Dixie and here on Bradford and Brooks in just a moment. Stay tuned. All right, you're back with Bradford and Brooks, Jim Brooks and Margie Bradford, and our very special guest, Dixie Hibbs. Now, I would be remiss as a host of Bradford and Brooks if I didn't mention that today is my co-host, Margie Bradford's birthday.
That's right.
So happy
Very
birthday,
good,
Margie.
Margie.
Oh,
Yes,
thank you.
yes,
Thank you.
absolutely.
I don't know if we got you on the birthday list during Party Line or not, but you're on our list, that's for sure.
All
That's
right,
for sure.
Well, that's the list that counts.
I'm going to give you that Christmas gift that I forgot to bring you at Christmas. How about that?
Well, you might as well save it for
For next
Christmas.
one, that could do that.
I thought I was the only one that did
Oh,
that.
Lordy, yes. Well, anyway, Margie doesn't get any older. She just gets better. It's kind of like a good whiskey,
That's
a
right.
good bourbon. She's aging well, aging well. Okay, I'm going to finish with my list of distilleries here now, but I want to talk about the ups and downs of the distilling industry, bourbon industry, because we really had some. Barton 1792 used to be known as Barton's Distillery, and before that, Tom Moore. Heaven Hill was built in 1936. James B. Beam is in Bullitt County, but we also have a distillery at Boston, called, and Claremont in Bullitt County and in Boston. The Log Still Distillery is in New Haven, and it's log still, but it originally was J.B. Dant. Bardstown Bourbon Company is on Parkway Drive. It's along the Bluegrass Parkway. Thank you. I tried to think which name we all call it, Bluegrass Parkway. And it's the one that is making whiskey for everybody. Old Steelhouse Distillery is the old T.W. Samuels Distillery out at Samuelson, Deatsville. That was the distillery built by the Samuels family in 1936, and then Bill Samuels left that group in 1943 and bought a distillery in Loretta, outside of Loretta, in 1953. Started making Maker's Mark there. So we claim Maker's Mark because the family was living here the whole time that they were working on all that. Anyway, during the Second World War, the government required the distilleries to make alcohol for the war, for making gunpowder and other things. And so they were only able to make bourbon or whiskey for 1 month out of the year. But their warehouses were pretty full. They weren't, there's not as many as you see out today, but they had whiskey. After the war, they thought they were really going to take off. And they took off very slowly. And during the 50s and 60s, things looked kind of glum here. People were drinking the gin and vodka and cocktails and things like that, and they weren't drinking their father and grandfather's bourbon. And we headed into the 80s and 90s. We still were making it, but we still had the Beam, Barton's, Heaven Hill, Willits, and then Willits for a while had to close, and they reopened.
Right.
And we didn't have all of these different distilleries that we have today. But what happened? Did somebody just discover that this was a cure for cancer or something? No. No. It's marketing and exclusivity. Don't ask me to spell that. I never have been very good at that. But the idea that came up, and this came up in the late 80s, early 90s, and Booker Noe was a distiller for Jim Beam. This was something going on all the time and had been going on for over 100 years. The distillers would go to the warehouses. They'd go to the third or fourth, fifth floor. They would get in the middle of the warehouse where all of the heat and the cold and everything would have been concentrated, I guess, where it would be consistent right there.
Right.
All right. They would take something called a whiskey thief. This is hard to see. It's made out of copper, I guess, brass or something metal. And it's a big straw. And you held it like this, put your thumb over it, you put it down through the bung hole, took the bung out, put this there, and when you came up with it, by pulling up on it, you had a cross section of the whole barrel. Not the top, not just the top or the bottom, you had the whole barrel. And you took your finger off of this, put it in a cup, and you sampled it. They still do this all the time. What was different now, they were looking for the best. Booker Noe wanted to choose the ones that he thought were the best in that warehouse. They bottled it, labeled it, noted how many bottles they had, It was the choice of the distiller. It was a select whiskey. It was good for consumption and for conversation. Consumption and conversation. And it made great advertising. Booker's is because this is Booker's choice. Russell's choice from Wild Turkey, Jim Russell. Elmer T. Lee from Buffalo Trace. All of them got on board. And all of a sudden, these older whiskeys, they weren't just older, it was every year the weather's different. Believe it or not, it's different. It's hotter and colder and colder and hotter.
Sure.
All right. So that year's aging might be better than the 4 years ahead of it. You might have 4 years that are really good, maybe 4 years not so good. So that's the reason for trying to sample. Makers likes a consistency, and if you've ever noticed, there's no age on Makers labels. It's around 8 years, but it could be 7 years. They're not going to put the age on them because they want to bottle it when it reaches the taste, the actual consistency is what they're looking for. Labels tell you a lot. If you all look at your whiskey label, it'll tell you quite a bit. All right, if you've got the leading distilleries here, all over, Louisville, Brown-Forman, everybody got on board with this, particularly when they started putting them in special. Booker's had a special wooden box that they put it in. It was almost a presentation box. You could buy that for a gift for your boss or your mother-in-law or whatever you wanted to, and knowing that they were going to appreciate it because they knew it was going to cost more.
A status thing.
A status thing, yes. And you could talk about the fact that this man went up in those old hot warehouses, 7-story warehouses, hot as the devil in the summer. If you don't think of it, you look at these guys building them come off. They are soaking wet. And this has been chosen, that barrel. In fact, they'll even say on the label what barrel it came out of. I mean, they give you all kinds of information to talk about.
Right.
That way.
Exactly.
Well,
everybody becomes a connoisseur.
There we go. And everybody wants to be the first one to find it and talk about it. Well, this became a great marketing thing, but it also became a way of using some of the older whiskeys they had that they didn't have enough to really make a run. And I say a run, you have a certain number of bottles you want to bottle on that.
Right.
Now, the other thing I want to say, the old distilleries would only distill in the spring and the fall. They never did in the summer.
Right.
They didn't have enough water. Now they do it year-round. But the summer and the fall, and always the spring batch they liked best. And I think it was because it was actually aged longer. Because by the time they got around to bottling it, they had gone through more months than they had otherwise that way. But and then the other thing about the boom, why we have the bourbon. Oh, I can't remember this. Guild. The Bourbon Capital Guild, which is an organization that you buy membership in. It is educational. They get you in lots of places you can't go as a private citizen. It's to learn about and appreciate and
promote
and join with others. And that David would like this. He would like that very much. But anyway, that is an organization here in Bardstown, and Sam Lacey's in charge of it. And anyone that wants to know more about and sample more whiskeys and things, they should contact Sam Lacey at the old courthouse here. He has an office there. The compass in front of the courthouse, that is a compass that shows how many miles to different distilleries. To show if you're standing there, you can probably see about 15 different distilleries and how far they are from where you're standing. That also comes across that if you're on the Bourbon Trail, you don't have to go too far to take part in it. And if you're trying only with like a couple of days or 3 days, 3 days you can do probably all 26 around. You can go to Lexington, Louisville, and all around Shelbyville. And as long as you don't stay all day at a place. Now, it'll take you months to stay all day at everywhere.
Or sample too much at any.
That's why. The Bourbon Festival took off over 30-some years ago, and it put Bardstown on the map as far as being celebrating bourbon, and the people who make it, the people who bottle it, the truck drivers, the farmers who, all that. The whole idea was to recognize it's not just the suits in the office and the advertising people. It's the people from the ground up that make this product and are proud of it.
And that's when you started having the
Japanese
people to come from Japan
and Portugal and other countries. I had several groups from Japan that came, and Mr. Ozaki had 5 bourbon bars in Tokyo. And this is when Scotch whiskey was really going in Japan. They weren't buying much bourbon. But he was having Kentucky bourbon, American beef, and American jazz music. And he had quite a group of clients and customers.
Almost a plane load of people over.
Well, he would bring a busload every time he came, and he came for 10 years. And he came for the Bourbon Festival, and we danced, and we had parties, and we
had dinner at my house one night.
There we go, we did, and he always went to Bill Samuel's house, his private house, and had dinner, because he bought more Maker's Mark in Tokyo than any other place, in Tokyo. So Bill remembers Mr. Izaki and his family and all, and it's hospitality again. They love Kentucky, they love the scenery, and all of that. So even if you don't drink, I know we're running out, even if you don't drink, think of it this way. We have so much hospitality here, we have to share it with somebody. Your face is going to get tired of smiling if you don't share it with somebody. But the reality is that people compliment us on how clean our streets are, beautiful flowers up and down. If you haven't been down on Main Street, go look at
gorgeous.
The flowers.
Yeah.
And we're proud of the expertise of our people who build those warehouses. Someone asked me, when's it all going to fall apart? And I said, talk to the distillery owners. They're putting millions and millions of dollars in these buildings.
Right.
And they're doing it because they are looking forward to the market in 10 years, 12 years.
Right.
They know something we don't know, or they wouldn't be putting $5 million a piece in those warehouses. Thank you for listening to me.
Well,
Thank you for coming in, Dixie.
Dixie, several years ago, it was when they opened the original Heaven Hill visitor center.
Yes, I was mayor then.
And I was talking to just conversation with Max Shapiro.
Yeah.
And I said, well, Max, I said, this industry has just kind of almost resurrected from the ashes when you go back 15, 20 years.
15 years,
I said, how did you see this coming? He said, I don't think anybody could have predicted where we are today.
No.
From, going back a dozen years or 20 years.
No.
He said, it's just been amazing.
Well, see, that was 2004 or 5, yeah. And again, that was the idea of George, his cousin had that idea about that. The same way down in Louisville, they have the Evan Williams Center in Louisville.
Yeah.
But it's advertisement you can walk in and experience. It's not just something on a page. And that's what Bardstown is. It's a place you can walk in and have lots of experiences. Who would have thought we'd had a brewery in the middle of the bourbon capital? And we have wineries. I mean, we have it all here that way.
Right. And you can go home and tell your friends about it, too.
Oh, yes, do they ever. Do they ever.
Word of mouth.
That's right.
All right. Well, Margie, again, we got about a minute left. Hope you are having and will have a great birthday.
Any plans?
Listen, I'm walking, talking, and making halfway good sense. It's a wonderful birthday.
I always say if I know who I am and where I am. Those are the first two things. And then I try to figure out what day it is. That's the only other thing.
That's what this is for.
There we go, yeah.
The phone will tell you. All right. Well, Margie and I will be back next Wednesday with another Bradford and Brooks. And so until then, I hope you have a wonderful week. And I think we're due for some nice sunny weather coming up this week after our episodes of rain and wind and everything and the remnants of Hurricane Beryl. So until then, have a great week, everybody, and we will see you next Wednesday with another Bradford and Brooks. Take care.